Howdy, folks. Bjorn was also kind enough to tell me that I have way more time than I thought I did, so I'm going to have to intersperse a bunch more boring anecdotes. So as Bjorn mentioned, I'm going to go through the brief resume, and I do have a point to this. This isn't a please defer to me because I've been at this shit a long time. But I was a Google SRE from 2004 to 2021. In Dublin the entire time, started as a junior systems administrator and ended as the director for all of storage and databases SRE. On call for a lot of different services, the usual stuff, stayed there far too long, and since then I've been at Elastic and at Twilio. And aside from being able to say that I've been an SRE for almost 20 years, which I wouldn't recommend as a thing to be able to say. What I would characterize this and the story I'm trying to tell here is that what I've been dealing with in my day-to-day life has gone from obviously tech, towards the start. I went into people management, and day-to-day I was dealing with or working with people, and nowadays, certainly in the last couple of years at Google and at Elastic and at Twilio, I'm dealing with what I'll call stakeholders, right? Now, stakeholders kind of look like people. If you isolate them in the room and look at them with your eyes, they look like people. But they differ from people in a very key way, which is that they only care about one thing, and they will ruthlessly pursue that thing until they get it, right? And so you could, I occasionally play the role of a stakeholder also, but for the most part, if I'm going into a room behind closed doors with finance, they're like, take up fewer finances, please, right? If I'm going into a room with, product folks, they're like, make more product go, please, right? And it's appropriate that that's what they're there to do, so that's what they're going to figure out. And out of this whole stew of things that we try to do comes, business outcomes like how many SREs do we want to hire? What organization do we want? All of that kind of thing. So my life is a roller coaster. That's the long and short of what I've been up to. So they left it till later in the morning for the first argument to start. So what I will say is a lot of the content here mightn't apply to you or your organization. By definition, we as SREs come into very different organizations that think very differently about what SRE is. And often when I go to SREcon, which I don't do enough, a lot of it is about how we do the work, and then a lot of it is sort of existential crisis as to what it is that we are exactly. And that's appropriate. We're still in our infancy in some respects in terms of a job function, which means that if I go, as I have in the last few years, between a couple of different enterprises, SRE are subtly different things, depending on the history of the company and, who started SRE and, whether or not they were religiously going from a book or whether they, used some common sense. And so some of it may not apply to you, but I consider that a vindication of just how varied our profession is. And, whether or not you consider that to be a good thing, up to you. It certainly applies to some of us. So my intention here is to sort of evoke thought and discussion among ourselves and etc. through some sort of mild trolling, hence the title of the talk, which I do mean, and I'll get on to why I mean that presently. So I have a similar approach to slides as the previous speaker, but I have 10 slides total. So so I'm going to talk a lot through all of these slides, and most of these slides are sayings or aphorisms that I've learned over the course of my career, and that ring true no matter how you apply them. And I was told this very early on in my career, and it stood to me. And this is even a pre-Google thing. And what it is, the reward for good work is more work. If you do something, you better be prepared to do more of it, right? And that applies to the kind of thing that you are doing. The outcome might be good, but if what you are doing to achieve that outcome is something you're not happy with, then it doesn't matter. You're going to be asked to do more of that thing. And the smartness that gets introduced into that into the process that ensures that the same outcome happens is really up to you. And so the job of any engineer is to find a better class of first world problem. Right? You invent a steam engine because you want to breed fewer horses, right? And such it has been now and into the future. So this is especially true of SRE, being systems thinkers and being folks who think about constraints like the speed of light and how many hard drives humanity is making and all the other wonderful things we had to care about at Google way back in the day. And so we say cute phrases like you should automate yourself out of a job every 18 months and all of that sort of stuff as sort of mnemonics for try to be doing different things maybe this time next year, right? If you're doing the same kind of work next year as you're doing today, you're probably not moving fast enough. And the reward that you will have for not moving fast enough is more of the kind of work that you are doing today. And think about whether or not that's a good thing for you. So, SRE has, of course, matured in this approach. We think of things less as a sort of a band-aid on top of toil and more as sort of like what is the approach, what's the engineering approach that we take to the problems that we face, right? And how do we be smart about that? The talk is about on-call, so I'm going to talk a bit about on-call. We're not going to eliminate on-call entirely, right? Shit happens. At some point we have to acknowledge that, somebody has to be disturbed if a thing goes wrong, and any of the sort of anyone who has dealt with a system of any scale will know that you cannot account for literally at the end of hunting season in Atlanta, Georgia, people run out of deer to shoot and start shooting distribution boxes on the top of poles, right? And say, bet you can't shoot that, and then they shoot it, and then a dashboard goes nuts in Dublin. Right? You can't plan for that, or, you go look at a ticket and it's like, why did that, power failure domain go away? And then you go find a ticket from hardware ops, and the ticket includes a photo which is a silhouette of a cat beside a power distribution unit, right? And so these are all things that have happened, and so you cannot plan for them. Stuff will still happen. The main problem that I have with on-call is that it is considered to be special, right? SRE will continue to be seen as magical pixies, and only we can do on-call, and only we can do particular stuff, and a sort of what I've started calling toxic exceptionalism that says that, only these magical people can be on-call, and just how whatever the opposite of disingenuous, like that argument is. So what I'll say just to round out this slide is, think of the kind of work you want to be known to be good at. Think of the kind of work that you want to definitely do more of, because by default, that's what you get. The reward for good work is more work. And so on-call is a waste of time. And what do I mean by that? So there's a subtle difference between something being a waste of time and something being a bad idea, right? So, and the analogy I generally use with folks and with stakeholders is if you were based in the US, and I've never been based in the US, so I'm going off secondhand information. If you're based in the US, you do your tax returns. Like you fill out your taxes, you do it every year is my understanding, and you do some maths or math as it's called there, and you file that, and that's wonderful, and everyone complains about it, and it's not really great, and nobody likes it, right? Do you want to be good at doing your taxes? Is that a goal of yours? You want to be really good at doing individualized tax returns? Not really. You want to do about as much tax return as you need to and then move on with your life, right? And one thing I will say, coming from Ireland, where the majority of people never file a tax return in their lives, because that tax return is a result of policy, right? For the most part, people who do work and pay the amount of tax and don't have weird, aren't a landlord and don't have weird, RSU income and all that, they never file a tax return in Ireland because the tax authority does their taxes for them, right? And so there's a couple of factors that come into, why that's not the case in the US, and such as my understanding. Somebody will probably correct me, but it's not the case in the US because it just isn't. right? Because it's kind of always been that you do your taxes. Like, why would you not do your taxes, right? And also, for example, there are lobby groups who specifically set out to make it more complicated to file your taxes so that they can sell you tax filing software, right? So there are people with perverse incentives. You know, there are people who love the status quo. There are people who, just kind of are spoilers in the way of progress, right? And progress there is possible, right? I have lived in progress for my entire life, and up until those horrible people at Google gave me a bunch of RSUs, I had filed no tax returns, right, for my entire life. And many people, I don't know how it is in various jurisdictions around Europe, but like in Ireland, certainly it's like most people don't. So I'm still only kind of trolling when I say that on-call is a waste of time, because it mostly is. Like, it's not going anywhere, but it doesn't mean we have to like it, and it doesn't especially mean that we have to be good at it. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because again, this is where most of the arguments go. And I want to talk about what I'm calling the fetishization of incident response. Right. And what I mean by the fetishization of incident response is on-call being complicated is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. If you, and again, going back to, of course, the majority of my career is at Google, so I'll give some Google examples, right? I've seen teams where they insist that you have to be on the team for 3 months or 4 months or 6 months before you can be on call, right? I've seen teams where you have to pass a series of tests, right? I've seen teams where you have to essentially do an interview with a black belt, with a person who's, a tech lead on the team, and impress them with your knowledge of on-call before you are permitted to be on call. And I'm here to tell you that is some hot bullshit, right? Because gatekeeping the ability to participate in on-call is actively working towards making it more complicated, right? You then have a perverse incentive and a vested interest in, at best, not making it less complicated, right? Because then you feel less special, right? And to continue the Google example, like Google will talk about DIRT, their disaster recovery testing, right? Which is, you should do business continuity testing, you should test that your backups work, you should do all this sort of stuff. Except if you're at Google, it's called DIRT, right? And everyone says, oh, we borrowed all these things from FEMA, so we're going to pretend we're FEMA. You're not FEMA, right? You're testing your business continuity. In other enterprises that I've been in, they call it game days, right? So Twilio, we call them game days. We say, next week there's going to be a game day. I'm not going to pretend that the West Coast has fallen into the sea, right? I'm not going to pretend that a thing has happened. I'm going to improve your muscle memory when dealing with incidents to the extent appropriate, right? And we'll all kind of get on with our lives. And so there's an element of pageantry about incident response that often people don't know that they're doing it. They just kind of think it's cool, right? They just kind of go, okay, well, being on call is cool and I get a kick out of it and I get a rush out of it. And that's real. I've been on call and I've experienced that and I've gone like, yeah, we're really solving problems here. It's kicking off the right endorphins in my brain, that I have solved a problem and it's wonderful. But in terms of like an overall retrospective, how much expertise did I have to build up to be able to deal with that? How much of the complexity involved in the incident response was really, truly necessary, right? The other key thing around the fetishization of incident response is the feel the pain thing, which I've seen come up a lot, where and it's often leveled at, when you want to put product devs on call, they need to feel the pain of on call. It's possible to learn about something without it inflicting pain on you, right? It is possible to develop a set of muscle memory and for that to be a pleasant experience. And McCall Brian Scanlon over in Intercom has a good talk on that and a good set of articles on that, where people volunteer for on-call, right? And it's actually not terrible. And so pain is not weakness leaving the body. It's generally pain entering the body, right? That's at least when it comes to on-call. So to tie the two things I'm kind of trying to say here together, so there's an attitude that only SREs can be on call. That is a fairly pervasive attitude. It may not be pervasive in your organization, but I'm gonna wave my hand and say it's fairly pervasive, speaking as somebody who deals with stakeholders. And I'll talk about stakeholders again in a second when we get to the management science bit. Only SREs can be on call one premise in my head. On-call is actually a waste of time, another premise in my head. So these don't really gel, right? Why is this considered valuable? Like, why is this, a wonderful thing that we want to continue? So now we're going to get on to the managery bit. So, pretend to be awake for a minute if you're allergic to management style stuff. I'm going to talk about stakeholders again. Stakeholder management. So at some point behind the scenes, there is somebody or some small set of people that is deciding, should we hire another, it's never as straightforward as this, but the basic premise is, should we hire another product suite or should we hire another SRE? What is the effective force multiplication that hiring another SRE does for us? Right. What do those people think about? What are the pieces of information that those people use to make that determination, right? And so, again, personal experience, but like a lot of personal experience, I'm here to tell you that a lot of the thinking and method behind many of those stakeholders' sort of data that they use to make these decisions is also hot bullshit, right? I talk with a lot of those people, and when talking about whether to invest in SRE, i.e. add more SREs, there's a very, very clear, easy and hard path, right, when you're thinking about how many SREs you need. The easy path is the path I see people following most often, and generally they will say, we need more SREs because our systems are broken. We need more SREs because we need to follow the sun so that my precious devs don't get woken up overnight. We need to follow SRE because follow the sun because I read it in a book somewhere. Any number of things. So even if we pay SREs the same, which I hope we do at least, there's still value in many stakeholders' minds because they don't think like you or I, they only look like people. There's still a very tempting path where one group does product and the other group does operations, right? And if that group who does operations comes to you and says, we find it therapeutic to call ourselves engineers and to also do engineering work, they're like, cool, bonus, right? This is way more pervasive than many people think. I've spoken to people at VP plus level at Google who have this exact mentality, right? Who are like, I don't want my engineers woken up, and we're like, okay, we're going to add a bunch of SREs so that doesn't happen. And he's like, I'll sign that check, right? And that's the end of the discussion, right? Everything after that becomes talking among ourselves as SREs about like, cool, somebody signed off on, I believe the site minimum at Google was 6 or 7 per site, right? Somebody signed off on 14 headcount. What are we going to do with it? We're going to hire it, obviously, but then what's it going to do, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that like, by the time the headcount hits the ground, or the mandate to hire more SREs hits the ground, the folks who are doing that at the management and even at the director level aren't aware that their key stakeholders over in the business kind of have taken the easy path to justifying things, right? I'll talk about the hard path in a minute. So the hard path is us kind of losing the crutch of on-call and incident response and tactical response as a crutch for proving our value to the business, right? So at the moment, if you're going talking to stakeholders or if I'm going talking to stakeholders, I hold the trump card of I pulled your ass out of the fire last week, the week before, 4 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago. That's wonderful. We do pull people's ass out of the fire in a general sense. That's an anti-pattern. That's not a thing we should plan to do, because again, with my stakeholder hat on, where I remove all humanity and put my hat on, the perverse incentive there is like, that means outages are good, right? It's an opportunity for us to demonstrate value, right? I'm not going to go cause outages, but I'm not going to be all that sad if we have a cool outage that we can write up in a post-mortem and say, isn't it great that we saved the universe, right? Yeah, it's good. It's good for morale. But it's not good for SRE's mandate as a whole, either within your enterprise or more broadly within this room. So I'm not saying we should be bad at on-call or incident response, or that on-call should be sort of dumbed down so anyone can do it. I am saying it should be shared co-equally, right? So we'll get on to more practical things, but where I've had the ability to do so, I've said, yeah, increasingly smaller companies have started doing the, oh, you build it, you run it, and then we add SREs, and then we have the conversation about, okay, what do SRE do now? Do SRE take over the on-call? Right, which the answer is no, right, they don't, because SREs aren't magical pixies that are, somehow better or more suited or enjoy on-call more than general purpose devs do. And also the additional anti-pattern which I've called out, which is SREs kind of tend to make on-call more complicated than it needs to be, because if they make it part of their identity, then that's something they're going to do. So the training wheels is the easy path, right? It's saying, cool, thank you for the headcount. I'm going to do a good job of on-call and also, I guess, do some engineering work, right? And we need to be thinking about, like, are SREs sufficiently rare within our organizations such that, we have a useful number of SREs, but not too many folks spinning their wheels just because somebody signed off on hiring too many SREs. And I see a bunch of the 25% of the room who are managers sort of going at the moment because, people like being given headcount. The post-magical era. So I'm going to talk about some specific exercises that I've run behind closed doors for my own teams, and some exercises that you can run either with your own leadership groups, be you an IC, you can sort of just have this as a thought exercise within your leadership group, be you a manager or a director or a VP, have these exercises with your leadership groups. So I've generally sat people down and sort of gone, okay, thought experiment. What if there was no on-call? None, right? What if it just try not to think about the logistics of it too much. Imagine there was no on-call. Imagine there was no incident response, that we were able to take the software that we produce and throw it over the wall and it never broke, right? What would we be doing, right? And I get very, very interesting answers, because the answer, or the correct answer, is almost never exactly what we're doing today, right? And for the most part, where I drive that conversation is that we say, okay, can we right, is the team too big then? Can we right size the size of the team, right? Again, we're not going to do this, but like, can we make the team smaller such that we actually suit the work to the amount of people on the ground, right? And that can be a very interesting conversation, because it feels like self-sabotage. It feels like a conversation where people then go, well, let's never speak of this outside of this room, right? And the catch is, like, it's easy to justify the existence of project work when it's already staffed, right? And I've gone through this exercise many times when we go through headcount planning or annual, whatever it is, and stakeholder, blah, 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 is that people come and say, okay, do your +1, -1 exercise. If you had one more SRE, what would happen? If you had one fewer SRE, what would happen? Wonderful, all this sort of stuff. But the basic premise of these exercises is what you've got already is cool. Like, what you've got already is the correct number, right? And so what I do is I go through the exercise with all of the larger projects that are initiated inside of SRE, and I'm like, cool, what if we didn't have this project and we wanted to ask for the headcount afresh to staff this project? Like, would that pass the giggle test? Like, would we be able to justify that headcount in the absence of us also having a large enough team to staff an on-call rotation, right? And that's usually why my managers don't like these kinds of meetings that I have, because they don't like being asked that kind of thing. It can seem very self-sabotaging, but I think it's a very important part of the larger, broader justifying our existence and justifying our value proposition conversation. Second exercise I generally do is, and I've written it here, imagine a deranged exec has demanded that all on-call must be shared co-equally by engineer. Right, so, waves magic wand and says, every engineer at this company, be you a product dev, be you an SRE, has to do, an equal amount of on-call, right, or an equal amount of ticket work or whatever the tactical stuff that you do is. what would that look like? What would you have to change in order for that to be workable, right? What parts of being on call do you think are so complicated now that only SREs can do it? What elements of risk are involved in having sort of an uninvolved person, or to your mind, an uninvolved person come in and do an on-call shift? What if, a really bad thing happens during that on-call shift and that person is not good at incident management, for example, or is not familiar with our incident management processes, or doesn't really know our tooling? What parts of that can we move to other bits of the organization, right? What parts of that can we make part of muscle memory? What kind of work can we make super obvious as you go about your business, right? And then, of course, the kicker at the end of that exercise is that I then ask, well, why haven't we done that already, right? One of the examples I'll give from Twilio is that Twilio is a central incident management team, right, that manages all incidents at Twilio from inception, does the incident command thing, does the follow-up, all the way to let us go affect people's sprints and affect people's roadmap planning based off of the fact that we have post-mortem action items and these need to get followed up, right? Because, again, and this is and this is a Google-specific thing, right? There's a very Google and a very Silicon Valley, if you'll forgive me for a second, anyone from Silicon Valley, notion that all kinds of smartness are the same. And so if you're a good coder, that means you're a good engineer, right? And if you're a good engineer, that means you're good at basically everything, right? You'll be good at running an incident, you'll be a good manager, you'll be a good, whatever kind of smartness, right? And so it's a conceit that's very, very prevalent of well, clearly you should just read the documentation more and then you will be good at incident management when it comes up. And that's not true, right? What parts of it can we outsource to a function that is useful, such as incident management, and how are we able to do that? And so that's why my management offsites are fun. Last slide, the SRE value proposition. I mainly put this slide in, so if there are any senior leadership at Google who happen to be here, I'll give them mild blood pressure problems, because this is something that folks at Google have been thinking about a lot. The SRE value proposition, how do we make sure that, for example, when we add new SREs, it's for a good reason, et cetera, like that. For everyone else, and for SRE as a whole, the value proposition is huge. One of the places that we need to decide where we're going is how do we raise all boats when it comes to how we are viewed by key stakeholders. Moving the needle there isn't done yet, isn't even nearly done yet, right? I speak to people today, as I've spoken to people for my entire career in SRE, who are just like, I don't want my engineers paged. If you want to do other shit, by all means do it. They say it nicer than that, but they're still saying it, right? And it's on us to really define, outside of, forgetting about on-call, forgetting about tactical response, what are the engineering outcomes that we are driving? How can we justify our existence based off of, that alone, without the easy mode crutch of we also save your ass every couple of weeks or every couple of months. And so that's the key message. When I say on-call is a waste of time, it is, right? It's a massive spoiler, and it's a massive distraction from, how we define our value to engineering as a whole, right? And this is industry-wide. Everyone experiences it to some extent. And I think that we're going to have some serious conversations with ourselves about, what is the engineering that we do? Can we, at some point, remove the training wheels of tactical response and on-call and et cetera from our remit and stand on our own as an engineering function that's indispensable in its own right? So that is my talk. Thank you.